It was a peaceful morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood, birds chirping, sunlight streaming through the trees, and the hum of daily life starting to pick up. But that calm didn't last long. A black man, let's call him Marcus, had just finished parking his car near a driveway when he noticed something unusual. He was careful not to block the entrance, but as he stepped out of his vehicle, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Moments later, the front door of a nearby house flew open, and out stormed a woman. You know the type, entitled, angry, and ready to pounce. People would soon come to know her as Karen. Karen's voice cut through the neighborhood as she accused Marcus of trespassing and being suspicious. Marcus calmly tried to explain that he was visiting a friend who lived just a few doors down, but Karen wasn't having it. She pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and began spinning a story about a dangerous man in her neighborhood. Marcus stood there, stunned but composed, as he realized what was happening. He knew exactly what this was, a racial profiling incident in plain sight. But here's where the story takes a turn Karen never saw coming. As Marcus waited for the police to arrive, he noticed something odd about Karen's driveway, something that didn't quite add up. Curious, he took a closer look and discovered something that would leave Karen speechless and everyone else questioning her motives. What did Marcus find? And how did Karen's attempt to humiliate him backfire in the most unexpected way? Stick around to find out, because this is a story about courage, justice, and a twist Karen never saw coming. As Marcus stood there, his eyes drifted back to Karen, who was now pacing back and forth on her driveway, phone still pressed to her ear. She was animated, gesturing wildly as she spoke to the 911 operator. Her voice carried over to Marcus, and he could hear the exaggerated descriptions she was giving of him. Words like threatening and dangerous that didn't remotely match his calm demeanor. It was infuriating, but Marcus kept his cool. He had been in situations like this before, and he knew better than to escalate. While Karen kept her focus on her phone call, Marcus glanced around the driveway again. Something wasn't adding up. Her accusations didn't make sense, his car wasn't blocking anything, and he hadn't even set foot on her property. But there was something else. As he looked closer, he noticed a small corner of the driveway that seemed uneven, almost like a piece of it had been hastily patched up. It wasn't obvious at first glance, but the longer he stared, the more curious he became. Marcus didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's aggression wasn't just about him. There had to be more to this. Why was she so quick to call the police over something so trivial? Was she trying to distract him from something? The questions swirled in his mind as Karen continued her dramatic performance, now looking over at him and shaking her head as if to paint herself as the victim. Meanwhile, neighbors started peeking out of their windows. A couple of them even stepped onto their porches, watching the scene unfold. Marcus noticed one man across the street, a middle-aged neighbor in a baseball cap, giving Karen a look that wasn't exactly friendly. If anything, he seemed annoyed, maybe even fed up. Marcus made a mental note of that. Was this Karen's usual behavior? Did the neighborhood have its own history with her antics? The sound of sirens faintly echoed in the distance, and Marcus's heart sank. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being painted as a criminal. But instead of panicking, he took a deep breath and reminded himself of the odd detail he had spotted earlier. Whatever Karen was hiding, Marcus was determined to figure it out. Little did she know, the truth was about to start unraveling, one clue at a time. As the sirens grew louder, Karen straightened up, crossing her arms like someone who believed justice was firmly on her side. Marcus stayed where he was, his calm composure now mingled with an edge of determination. He wasn't just going to let this slide, not this time. Something about the way Karen had escalated things so quickly felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. And that driveway, it kept pulling at his thoughts like a thread waiting to unravel a much bigger story. Karen's voice suddenly cut through the air again, this time directed at Marcus. "The police will deal with you soon enough," she said with a smug smirk. She was clearly enjoying herself, confident that the officers would see things her way. But Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he glanced across the street at the neighbor in the baseball cap, who was still watching intently. The man gave Marcus a small nod, as if to say, "I see you. I know what's happening here." Suddenly, Marcus noticed another detail about the driveway that made his pulse quicken. A faint discoloration around the patchy area. It looked like oil stains, but not the kind you'd expect from a car. It was darker, almost black, and oddly spread out. It didn't seem like anything natural or random. Karen must have caught him looking because she shifted her stance, blocking the spot with her feet. Her movements were subtle, but Marcus noticed. She knew. She knew there was something there. The police arrived just moments later, 2 patrol cars pulling up with flashing lights. Karen wasted no time rushing over, her voice dramatic as she started retelling her version of events. Marcus watched the officers closely, gauging their reactions. They listened to Karen, nodding at first, but their expressions didn't entirely match her urgency. One of them glanced over at Marcus, then at the growing crowd of neighbors, as if sensing that this wasn't going to be as straightforward as Karen had made it seem. Marcus decided it was time to speak up, but not before planting one last look at the driveway. He had a feeling that whatever Karen was hiding, they would change everything. And judging by the way her confidence seemed to waver the moment his eyes met hers, she knew her perfect little plan might not hold up for long. The police officers approached Marcus, their expressions calm but curious. One of them, a younger officer with a notebook in hand, asked Marcus for his side of the story. Karen hovered close by, arms crossed, glaring at him like she couldn't wait to interrupt. Marcus kept his voice steady, explaining that he had parked legally and wasn't blocking anything. He mentioned he was visiting a friend down the street and hadn't even set foot on Karen's property. The officers nodded, jotting everything down, but Karen quickly cut in. "He's lying," she shouted, pointing at Marcus. "He's been lurking around here for the past hour, acting suspicious. I don't feel safe in my own neighborhood." Her voice rose with every word, and a few neighbors exchanged skeptical glances. It was becoming clear that Karen was more interested in causing a scene than anything else. One of the officers held up a hand, signaling for her to calm down. "Ma'am, we're just gathering the facts right now," he said firmly. Karen huffed but took a step back, her frustration barely contained. The officer turned back to Marcus. "Is there anything else we should know?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, then decided to take a chance. "Actually, yes," he said, motioning toward Karen's driveway. "I couldn't help but notice something odd about that spot over there. It looks like it's been recently patched up. I don't know what's under it, but it caught my attention." Karen's face froze for a split second before she quickly recovered, shaking her head. "Oh, come on. That's ridiculous. What does that have to do with anything?" she snapped, her tone defensive. But her reaction wasn't lost on the officers or the neighbors, who were now whispering more loudly amongst themselves. The older officer narrowed his eyes and walked over to the driveway, kneeling to take a closer look. Marcus stayed silent, but his heart was racing. Karen started pacing again, muttering under her breath about wasting time and these people, but there was a crack in her confidence now. She was fidgeting, glancing nervously between the officers and the spot on the driveway. As the officer examined the area, the younger one asked Karen, "When was this driveway last worked on? Did you have any repairs done recently?" Karen stammered, struggling to come up with an answer. A few weeks ago," she finally said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. The older officer stood up, brushing off his hands. "Something doesn't look right here," he said, his tone measured but serious. Karen's eyes widened, and for the first time, her smug demeanor crumbled into something resembling panic. Marcus stayed quiet, watching the moment unfold. Whatever was under that driveway, it was clear Karen didn't want anyone to find out. The tension in the air was thick, and the neighbors had fully gathered now, some even pulling out their phones to record. The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "We might need to take a closer look," he said. Karen immediately stepped forward, her voice frantic. "That's unnecessary. It's just a patch job. You don't need tow." But the officers weren't buying it. The older one turned to her and said firmly, "Ma'am, if there's nothing to hide, then this shouldn't be an issue." Karen's face paled as she struggled to come up with a response, and Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. Whatever was about to happen, it was clear this was bigger than anyone had realized. The truth was closer than ever, and everyone could feel it. Karen's protests grew louder as the officers exchanged a nod, signaling they weren't backing down. The older officer stepped toward his patrol car, retrieving a small toolkit. Marcus watched silently, sensing that whatever came next would be pivotal. Karen, on the other hand, was unraveling. "This is outrageous," she shouted, her voice trembling now. "You can't just tear up someone's property without permission." The younger officer remained calm, addressing her firmly. "Ma'am, if there's reasonable suspicion that something illegal is going on, we have the authority to investigate further." Karen's face flushed red as she fumbled for words, but she couldn't seem to form a coherent argument. The neighbors, now fully invested in the unfolding drama, leaned in closer, their phones capturing every second. As the older officer knelt by the patched section of the driveway, Marcus couldn't help but notice Karen inching backward, almost instinctively moving closer to her house. It was subtle, but her movements spoke volumes. She was trying to distance herself from whatever was about to come to light. Marcus's curiosity deepened, but so did his unease. What could possibly be hidden there that would make her so desperate? The officer began chipping away at the surface, the sound of scraping concrete, breaking the tense silence. Karen looked like she might faint, her eyes darting between the officers and the crowd of onlookers. And then, just as the officer cleared away the first layer, something unexpected happened. A man's voice called out from the edge of the crowd. "Hold on. I know what this is about," he said, stepping forward. It was the neighbor in the baseball cap, his face serious but calm. All eyes turned to him as he continued. "That driveway patch. It was done late at night a couple of weeks ago. And Karen didn't hire a professional to do it, she did it herself. I saw her out there with bags of cement and a flashlight." The tension in the air shifted as his words sank in. Karen spun around to face him, her voice sharp. "You don't know what you're talking about. Stay out of this." But the neighbor didn't back down. "Oh, I know exactly what I saw," he said, crossing his arms. "And I'm guessing it has something to do with why the police came around here a few weeks ago, looking for that missing package." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. A missing package. This was new. Karen's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face drained of color, and she opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. The officers exchanged another look, the situation suddenly taking a much darker turn. The older officer paused his work and stood up, addressing the neighbor. "What do you mean by a missing package? Do you have more details?" The man nodded. "Yeah. A delivery driver said something valuable went missing around here. A bunch of us got questioned, but nobody knew anything, well, except for Karen. She was the only one who acted all defensive, saying she had no idea what they were talking about." The air grew heavier as the pieces began to fall into place. Marcus's eyes shifted back to Karen, who was now visibly shaking, her confidence completely gone. The patch on the driveway wasn't just suspicious, it was starting to look like evidence, and Karen's frantic attempts to divert attention earlier now made perfect sense. The officers' expressions grew more serious as they processed the new information, their focus laser-sharp on Karen. The crowd murmured in disbelief, and Marcus felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him. This wasn't just about a confrontation or a misunderstanding anymore. Whatever Karen was hiding beneath that driveway could change everything, and not just for her. Marcus could feel the story building to something explosive, but the full truth still remained out of reach. For now, all he could do was watch as the officers pressed on, determined to uncover the secrets Karen had buried, literally and figuratively. The older officer resumed working on the patch, his movements deliberate as Karen stood frozen in place, her breathing shallow. The murmurs from the neighbors grew louder, anticipation hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Karen looked like she wanted to run, but she knew there was nowhere to go. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced with a quiet desperation that spoke volumes. Marcus kept his distance, watching everything unfold with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. After several tense moments, the officer finally cleared away enough of the patch to reveal something beneath the surface. Everyone leaned in, straining to see. The officer paused, then carefully reached down and pulled out a small weathered box wrapped in plastic. It looked out of place, buried under a driveway, too deliberate to be a coincidence. The crowd gasped, and Karen visibly flinched as the officer held the box up for his partner to inspect. "What's in there?" someone from the crowd asked, their voice cutting through the tension. The younger officer carefully unwrapped the plastic and opened the box. Inside were stacks of cash, tightly bound, along with a few smaller items wrapped in cloth. The officers exchanged a glance, their suspicions confirmed. Karen's driveway wasn't just a cover-up, it was a hiding spot. Karen's voice broke through the silence, shaky and panicked. I don't know what that is. It's not mine," she stammered, backing away slowly. But her protests fell flat. The neighbors whispered among themselves, and Marcus noticed the man in the baseball cap shaking his head knowingly. Karen's behavior had already made her guilt obvious, but now there was hard evidence tying her to something bigger. One of the officers turned to Karen. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to explain how this ended up under your driveway," he said, his tone firm. Karen opened her mouth, searching for an excuse, but before she could answer, the older officer pulled out another item from the box, a delivery manifest with Karen's name on it. It matched the description of the missing package the neighbor had mentioned earlier. The crowd erupted in murmurs, and Karen's face turned pale as the weight of the evidence closed in on her. But just as it seemed the story had reached its peak, Marcus noticed something odd. One of the neighbors, a man who had been standing quietly off to the side, suddenly turned and walked briskly away. His behavior was subtle, but suspicious enough to catch Marcus's eye. Was there more to this than just Karen? The thought lingered as the officers handcuffed Karen, informing her that she was being detained for further questioning. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus approached the officers, mentioning the man's odd behavior. They took note, thanking him for his observation. It wasn't the ending Marcus had expected when Karen first called 911, but he couldn't help feeling that there was more to the story, layers of deceit that had yet to be uncovered. As Karen was led to the patrol car, her confident facade shattered, Marcus glanced one last time at the driveway. The truth had come to light, but the question remained. Was Karen acting alone, or was this just the tip of a much larger iceberg? For now, though, one thing was certain: her attempt to humiliate Marcus had backfired in ways she could never have imagined. And as the officers drove away, Marcus couldn't help but think that justice, though delayed, had finally caught up with her. As the police cars disappeared down the street, the once buzzing neighborhood slowly returned to an uneasy quiet. Neighbors lingered for a few moments, exchanging thoughts on what had just unfolded before gradually heading back to their homes. Marcus stood near the edge of the driveway, letting everything sink in. What started as a simple act of parking had spiraled into something far more significant. The man in the baseball cap approached Marcus, giving him a